In this brief demo of Cloud Access Manager 8.1, we're going to be taking a look at the OAuth API capabilities. Essentially what we're going to do is we're going to secure a web service using an OAuth access token. Now this may seem complicated, but it's actually very easy to do with Cloud Access Manager. But before we jump into a demo, let's take a look at architecturally what exactly is happening. So basically what I've done is I've created a web service. Let's open this up. We're going to call this the Weather Web Service. And inside the Weather Web Service, there are essentially two methods. One called getCity, we're just going to put GC. The other one called setCity. So we'll put this down here and say setCity. So getCity is where you pass in the name of a city, and the weather service returns the weather for that city. setCity is more of an enhanced feature. That's where if you're a weather authority, you're actually able to call that web service and program what the current weather is for that location. So this particular service, getCity, is generally a little bit less secure, right? You can call my weather service if you want. However, this one, I'm going to make sure I lock that down. Well, basically what we've done inside this web service is we've used a very simple technology called Dell Security, and I've said anytime someone makes a call to this web service, I want you to check the Dell Security header for an access token, an OAuth access token. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about what's contained inside that access token in a minute. But before I do, let's talk how I'm going to be calling that. So the first demo is going to be calling it from a consumer service. And by creating a consumer service, there's a paradigm in OAuth that we're not going to be seeing, and that's a login screen. We're never going to see a login screen pop up where a consumer service can log in, right? That's not going to happen with a service layer. A service layer is instead going to be using a client ID and a client secret, making an API call to Cloud Access Manager, right? So we'll put that down here. Here's CAM. And again, basically, this consumer service, the first thing it needs to do is make an API call to Cloud Access Manager and say, hey, I'm going to be calling this weather service. I need an access token. So that access token is simply going to be returned back to the consumer service, and it's going to say, here you go. Here's your access token. The consumer service is then ready to call the Weather Web Service. All right, so we're going to simply draw this out. That access token is going to be sent over to the Weather Web Service, where it's going to be consumed by the Dell Security architecture. And again, you could do this in a lot of different ways. But essentially, the web service is going to look inside the access token and determine what access rights you have to the individual methods. Now, there's a bit of a different paradigm, and that's the one where we do this interactively. I'm going to show that too. So in this case, we're going to be inside an application, and we have a user, actually two users, that are actually going to be logging in using this application. They're going to get an OAuth UI though. Okay, it's going to show an actual OAuth login screen from Cloud Access Manager. But aside from that difference, the rest of the interaction is basically the same. So again, the application is going to show this user an OAuth login screen that's actually coming from Cloud Access Manager. Cloud Access Manager is going to reply with an access token. We're going to show that in the UI. And then the application can now start making calls to the web service using that access token. Now, we're going to make one little change about the way that's being done, and you're going to see that when we show the demo. So again, go to your web service, write a security architecture. In this case, I'm using Dell Security. It's simply expecting an access token in the header, in the security header, and then using that access token, I'm going to allow you to call either one of these services. So let's take a look at how we set this up in Cloud Access Manager before we show the demo. We'll open up Cloud Access Manager, make our way to the administration screen, and then go take a look at two applications I have configured. One is called Company A. And if we open that up, we see inside Company A, it's got a client ID, it's got a client secret, and there are scopes that are associated with this definition. One is getCity, we see that right there, and then finally another one is called setCity. So this application definition basically says, using this client ID and this shared secret, you're allowed both of these scopes. Now let's cancel this and go take a look at Company B. Company B has its own client ID and its own shared secret, but a limited scope, right? It's only got the ability for getCity. So let's go take a look at this in action. The first thing we're going to take a look at is essentially a demo using a console application. It's not very exciting, but it does show how this is happening, and it's happening very easily and very quickly. So from a console application, we basically want to prove that we can get an access token without showing an OAuth login screen, and doing it through a console application basically drives that point home. So again, I'm going to make a call to this endpoint. Here's the client ID, the shared secret, and I'm going to be asking for these two methods. So let's go get an access token. So we've got the access token. It's been truncated, but it's listed right here. And then you can actually decode that access token. This is what I was alluding to earlier. Contained inside that access token is actually all the information you need to either lock or unlock a web service. So if we look right here, we see that there's a parameter called scope. And for this access token, there are two scopes that are allowed. So there really isn't a need to make a call back to Cloud Access Manager to validate this access token. The token itself is signed, so you know that it hasn't been tampered with and it's coming from a trusted source. So let's see it in real time with the web service. We'll go back here, run this demo, and this time we're going to make that call again using company A and his client ID and his shared secret. We're going to go get the token. There's the token. Now, of course, you don't need to display this in your application. There's really no need to do that. But now we're going to say, let's go over and use the weather service. I'm going to call get city. Works just fine. I'm going to call set city, and it works just fine. Now, why is that? Well, let's decode the token. Again, right here, we can see that inside the scope, there's get city and set city. So for this particular user, or for this particular service, really, he can call both of those methods just fine. And again, we saw that right here, and we saw that right here. Now, meanwhile, if we go to company B and get a token through an API, there's the updated token. Now we're going to go use the weather service and call get city. Works just fine. When we call set city, though, it doesn't work. So again, the question happening now is, well, why isn't it working? Well, let's go decode that token again. This is essentially the data that the web service is looking at. In this case, there's only one scope allowed, and that's get city. So again, calling get city works just fine. Calling set city does not work. The last quick example we're going to take a look at, though, is what if you're not actually generating scope and you want to secure your web services using roles? That's usually a paradigm that's more closely associated with user-based access. So if we go back over here and I say, well, let's change to company A and I want to get a token via web, I see a login screen. So we'll log in as myself. Now in Cloud Access Manager, there's a fresh token. In Cloud Access Manager, I've basically said Joe Campbell, within the context of this application, has this role. We're going to see what that is in just a second. So if he now tries to call the getCity method, it works just fine, passing in this token. If he calls setCity, it works just fine. But what I've done here is I've done something a little creative with the web service. I said, in lieu of having a scope, can you at least look at the roles that are returned by Cloud Access Manager? And you'll notice that there's a role here called Weather API Manager. Inside my web service layer, I've defined that you're allowed to do getCity and setCity if you have this role. This is a change from scopes, clearly, but it's something that's basically demonstrating flexibility in how you secure your web services. So let's try logging in as a different user. For that, I'm going to restart this app, make sure I clear out my cache. Let's go ahead and minimize this. So this time we're going to log in as George. So we're going to see the same UI. He's going to get his access token. We're going to see that right here. And then he's going to go and call the web service for getCity. Works just fine. He calls setCity, and it's basically challenged. And it's basically not allowed. We see the same fault being generated when you don't have access to a web service. Again, this is being simply conveyed inside the token. And if we decode the token, we see this time George only has the Weather API user role. And on my web services, I've defined, just like I said before, in lieu of having scope, look for role information. And if the role information is there, then go ahead and use roles to secure the web service. Now, just because I'm using a user doesn't mean I can't use the scope feature. The scopes still work within a user context, but I'm just showing flexibility in this scenario here. So to recap, set up your web service, secure it for OAuth access token security, get your access token from Cloud Access Manager, and embed that into the security header when you make your calls. Of course, it can be passed as a parameter too. However you want to secure your web service is basically up to you. And this concludes the brief walkthrough of using OAuth access tokens to secure web services.